Hey guys, it's Tay from Roy's, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make a controller swapper menu for your game. First, let's start with a little bit of groundwork. All I have here is just a main scene and a player, so if we play, all we can do is hop around. I'm literally using the template script for a character body 2D. So now, let's set up our controls for our game that aren't the built-in Godot controls. So if we go into project settings and input map, we can add our new controls. So let's add in jump, let's add in left, and then let's add in right. And then I'm going to set jump to space, left to A, and right to D. Perfect. So now if we go into our player script and modify it a little bit. So we just need UI left to be left, and UI right to be right. And I forgot to set our jump button, so I'm just going to set it now. Let's save that and give it a little test to make sure everything works. Jump works, left and right and A and D work. Perfect. Okay. Now let's start with our project. So let's create a new tab, and let's create a user interface. And I'm going to call this menu. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Now I'm going to add a couple of child nodes. So the first child node I'm going to do is a panel container. And panel container is going to contain an HBox container to align things horizontally. And then the HBox container is going to contain two VBox containers. So 1, 2. So now let's add 3 labels, because we have 3 controls we want to set into our VBox containers. So 1, 2, 3. And let's add 3 buttons into our second VBox container, because we have 3 controls we want to set. 1, 2, 3. And let's label this as jump. Actually, let's delete this, make the text a little bigger. Theme overrides, fonts, font sizes. Just skyrocket that a little bit. There we go. Let's duplicate this now. Jump. Left. And this one's going to be right. And now let's call this. This doesn't really need text. We just going to set text to see if it looks good. It does not. So let's just adjust the sizes again here. Font sizes, just increase that to about here, and then we're just going to duplicate it again. That's all we're going to need for our scene setup. So now let's add a script to our menu. So if we go up to menu and attach a script, and I'm going to call this controller manager and make sure it's of type C#. I think it gave me a template. Nope, we're good. So we're going to have to inherit a few things for our script to work. We're going to be using systems.collections.generic. We're going to be using system.io because we're going to need to save our file of our controls. And we're going to be using system.text.json because we need to parse our data into something that can be read from a text file. Perfect. Now we're going to need a couple global variables. We're going to need a bool to modify our control, to tell our script to modify the controls. We're going to need a string of the control we need to modify, so control action name. And we're going to need a button for the button that we want to set, so button text. Now we're going to need a string for where we want to save our JSON file. So to do that, we can just do string control path equals project settings dot globalize path and then we want to get the user version because that will give us something that works even when we compile our game. Now we want to create an instance so we can do the singleton pattern. So if we do public static control manager instance, and then we can set our instance in the ready variable. So instance equals this. That way we can access our script from other scripts easily. Now we need to get our button container, so we can just do export and get our button container. Or actually, this would be of type node. Button container. And this is just going to allow us to loop through all our buttons all at once. Now we're going to need a dictionary of saved inputs. And the reason I'm choosing dictionary is because we're going to be able to access everything through string very quickly. We don't have to loop through the dictionary every time we want to access a specific type of input that we're going to save. So we can do that with dictionary. The key we're going to have is a typed string, and the value we're going to have is of type byte array. And you're going to see as to why later. And I'm going to call this saved inputs, and I'm going to set this to new so that it's not null. Now I'm going to delete the process because we're not going to need it at all in our script. And I'm going to create a public void, and I'm going to call this change control. And we're going to take in a string for action name, and a button for our modify button. And now we're going to just do modify control. Nope. Modify control equals true. Control action name equals action name. And button text equals modify button. That's all we're going to need to do in this script for now. Let's go back into Godot and just confirm we don't have any compilation errors. We're good. And now let's add a script to our buttons. So I'm going to attach a script. I'm going to call this change input button. And we're not going to need any of this. We're going to need one export variable. Export public string controller action name. And we're going to set a private void on button click. So when our button's clicked, control manager, and I realize I misspelled control manager dot instance dot change control. We're going to pass in our controller action name that we're going to set in the inspector, and we're going to pass in our button. And actually, I realized we can use the public override void ready, and then just subscribe our button click to it, to our pressed, because it's a button. So pressed plus equals on button click. That's all we're going to need for the button script. So now, if we go ahead and we add our button script to each button, and now we're going to have to, well, first compile, and now we're going to have to give our controller action. So what this is in our project settings, our controller action is this name right here. So this one would be jump, left, and right. So we just have to set that here. So our controller action will be jump, left, and right. And that's all we're going to need for our button script. So let's go back into our menu script and let's finish off the menu. So if you remember, we have already set our modify control to true. So now we can create another function, public override void underscore input, take in an input event, and we're just going to say on this input, if not modify control, return. If we don't want to modify our controls, do nothing. So now we can just check if our input is of type input event. So event is input event, and I'm just going to call this an event key. And so now we just want to make sure our event key isn't mouse movement, because most games don't actually do any control with mouse movement, specifically like how this would handle it. So if event key is of type input event mouse motion, we're just going to return as well. So now we're going to access our input map, and input map is Godot's way of handling all the controls. So what we set in the menu to set our left, right, and jump controls are in the input map, and we're going to be modifying that now. So since our controls are going to be changed, we don't want anything in our input map under our actions. So if we go input map dot action erase events, we can just pass in our control action name, which we set up here. So this is going to erase all controls for our input map. So for example, if I go into Godot and I run the game, oops, I need to save this first. I'm just going to save this menu and drag it in here. So if I go in here and run the game, and then I click the button, I can't jump anymore. This erases all our jump functionality. And so we're now going to need to add in an event that we've just received. So input map.action add event, and we're going to add it in under the controller action name. So in the previous example, I did jump, controller action name, Oh, control action name. I got it wrong. And we're going to pass in our event key. So what this is going to do is this is just going to allow us to quickly modify our controls. So for example, if I click here and click T, for example, now T is my jump button. We haven't modified that yet to show it though. Now we're going to set our button text, .text equals event key .as text. And then we're going to set our modify control to false. And so if we run the game again, move out of the way, jump is space, or D, I guess. So now if I go right, I'm always going to jump. And left is going to be W. This is going to be the hardest to control game. And right is going to be enter. This is a hard to control game. So if all you want to do is modify controls, that's all you need. It's really not that complex. The more complex part comes in saving the controls and then loading them back into the game so user settings are saved. We're going to be doing that now. So if you remember, we created our dictionary up here of saved inputs. We're now going to actually add in the inputs we want into our saved inputs variable. So if saved inputs dot contains key, so if we've already assigned this controller in our saved inputs at control action name, we are just going to set our saved inputs to our new control. Control action name equals. Here's the part that gets a little more complicated. In programming, there's something called serializable fields, which essentially means, is this kind of text readable? Unfortunately for us, input events are not serializable fields, so we can't put this into a text file that's easily readable. There are ways around this though, and so Godot has this nice function, so gd.var 2 bytes with objects, and we can just pass in our event key. This is going to parse it into bytes which aren't readable at all, but at least we can serialize it and put it into our JSON file. And now we can do an else statement, because if it's not in the invention key, we can just do saved inputs.add control action name, and then we can pass in, again, our gd.var 2 bytes with objects and our event key. Now all our controls, once we've set them, will be saved in our dictionary. So this is all we're going to need for the input function. Now we're going to have to set up our input-output to save our controls into a JSON file. So we're going to create a private void save text to file. And again, if you've seen some of our other videos, like our save load video, this is all going to look extremely familiar, so I'm not going to explain it in the most detail. If you want another video, you can check the description. We've got a save load video that goes into much more detail there. If the directory doesn't exist, directory.exists, path directory.create directory of path that we're going to pass in. And now we're going to just join the path so that we can have the path in our file name. So path equals path.join, path file name. And now we're going to try catch a statement because unfortunately, when you're dealing with loading files from the hard drive, it can get buggy pretty quickly. So we're just going to have to do some checks for that. So file.write all text, path, and then write in all our data that we're going to pass into this function. And then we're going to catch exception E. And I'm just going to gd.pushError e.toString. So it'll let you know in the debugger if this errors out. Now we're going to need to be able to actually load files from our JSON file. So private string, load text from file. We're going to need to take in a path variable, and we're going to need to take in another file name variable. And we're going to do string data, because we don't have any data yet, equals null. Path equals path.join, path file name. And if the file does not exist with the path, just return null. This is not worth anything. Now we're going to try data equals file.read all text in the path, and we're going to catch the exception again. Catch exception e gd.pushError e.toString. That's all we're going to need from our save load. Oh, wait, whoops. We're going to need to actually return our data. Return data. That's all we're going to need for our save load functions. All it does is get a file from a path, save it, load it. So now we're going to need a way to actually call these functions to save and load our data. So let's create another function, and I'm going to call this public void save control data. We're going to take in no parameters, and we're just going to call our save text to file. And if you remember, we set our control path before. And I'm just going to hard code this as controls.json. If you want, you can create something in an inspector, but we don't really need anything. And then we're going to serialize, and then we're going to serialize our dictionary to put into the JSON file. To do that, we've already included JSON serializer, so JSON serializer, serialize saved inputs. And I'm going to just drop this down here to make it more readable. This is all we're going to need to save our data. So now if we create, we go back into Godot, we go into our menu, and we create another button, and I'm just going to call this button saved. We don't need this script attached. We just need to have this button tick. There's our save control data. Connect. So now when we click our save button, we're going to save all our control data to JSON. And I don't want this to be saved. I want this to be save. There we go. That looks better. Save that. And so if I go in, let's test this. So left, right, jump. I'm going to set this to W. So W is my jump. If I save, I'm back. I just got the save location. So I just printed out right in our ready where the control path was. So let's just go into that right now. And here's our controls JSON file. So if we open this with code, it's not going to look pretty. This is our jump button that's saved to W. Now, the harder part. So now we're going to need to load all this data into our game and set it for the user. So now let's load all our controls. So up here in ready, we can do string control data equals load text from file, control path, controls.json. And then if our control data is not null, does not equal null, we are going to deserialize our JSON inputs back into our dictionary. So saved inputs equals JSON serializer dot deserialize of dictionary with a string and a byte array control data. And I think that's wrong. There we go. And now we can call a set all controls function that we haven't built yet. And since it's going to throw an error, let's generate the method. So set all controls is going to loop through everything and set all our controls and then update our UI to reflect those controls. So we're going to loop through our button container that we have up here that we haven't set yet. And we're going to look for each of our change input button script. So for each change input button, child in button container dot get children. So if there's other ones in there, it's not going to do anything. If saved inputs dot contains key file dot controller action name, we're going to get a string temp equals child dot controller action name because we're going to be using it multiple times. Now we're going to erase our input map of the controller action name. Input map dot action erase events temp clear all the events. And now we're going to create an input event. We're going to parse our data back from the dictionary byte array back into an input map or an input event type. So to do that, we can do input event, and I'm just going to call this input event equals, and I'm going to go down here. We're going to parse it back into an input event gd.bytes to var with objects, saved inputs at the temp area. This is how we get our input event back. And now we can add it into our input map. So input map.action add event, temp, and add in our input event. And now we get to set our button text, so child.text, equals input event dot as text. Now that's great and all, but what if we're calling this and we haven't set up the controls in our JSON thing yet? So we're going to have to do an else statement, and then we're going to do if input map dot action get events And we're going to pass in our child dot controller action name equals null. So if we haven't set any controls for this, or input map or dot action get events, again, child dot controller action name dot count equals 0, and this didn't go with me. We're just going to continue. Go on to the next iteration of the loop. Now we can just set our button text to whatever the input map is by default. So child.text equals input map dot action get events child dot controller action name, and then we're just going to go to the 0 position because it gives it as an array as text. That should be all we need to have our thing to work properly. So let's test it out. Let's launch our game, and it should give me... Oh, wait, I realize we didn't set our button container. There we go. This is all our buttons, and so now we can just space to go right, or left mouse button, space. Hey, so I realized in the footage I just showed, I didn't exactly include a close button, so it was overlapping myself, and I was overwriting the controls that I wanted to set. So we're just going to add a closed button now. So I'm going to go into the first VBox container, I'm going to add a button, and I'm going to attach a script, and I'm just going to call this closed button. And all I'm going to do is on export node, and I'm just going to call this node to close. And then I'm going to create a function, private void close node. I'm going to take in no parameters. And I'm just going to set this to pressed. So when we press this button, plus equals close node. And now I'm just going to set node to close dot visible. And I just realized I need this to be a control node. Set this dot visible equals false. That's all we're going to need. Let's test it out. Close. There we go. That's all I wanted to do. That solves the error I was having in the video. Okay. Back to me. Save. Left mouse button to go left. A to go right, and W to jump. And so now if we go into our controls and delete them, it should automatically set our buttons text to our control text. Yep. So this is the default text we have. That's all for this video. If you got anything, I'd greatly appreciate a like. See you guys next time.